rapid earth fault current limiter devices. Those are, I think, specifically mentioned in the statute. But what else is there? And then the next question, how can they be combined? And maybe we should hear from one of the utilities first. And Matt, since you're on screen, I'll go with you.
Deal. Yeah, this is Matt Pender for PG&E. So when we look at a circuit segment that is highest on our wildfire risk score, we consider several alternatives for how we should mitigate the wildfire risk there. Overhead hardening, undergrounding, obviously. Remote grids is another solution. Is there a way where we can potentially break up the circuit into remote grids or smaller grids? And then there can be some other sort of hybrid solutions where you combine a couple of those. If we deploy one of those solutions, we would still evaluate if a operational mitigation, that is how we operate the grid, is appropriate to remain in place. Rapid earth fault current limiter is essentially one of those operational mitigations for how the grid operates, how it senses if there might be a fault and takes action to mitigate wildfire risk. We also have our EPSS program, Enhanced Power Line Safety Settings, and PSPS, Public Safety Power Shutoffs, which are essentially similar operational mitigations. And so we're looking at all of those things for each circuit segment that we identify as highest wildfire risk that we believe is appropriate to harden. And so explaining that, what our process is for reviewing alternative mitigations and providing that detail is appropriate. What that specific list of mitigation strategies is, may be different from one utility to the next, based on the way their grid works, based on what technology they've approved or not approved, and B, should be expected to evolve over time, right? Some of these technologies may evolve into a new solution, or we may identify something that we don't have right now. And so that's worth considering or having in mind when we're developing our plans. So we would expect to lay that out in our 10-year plan. Here's how we evaluate alternatives for each circuit segment. And we would expect to provide data on which ones we evaluated and what the conclusion was for each circuit segment.
Okay. Can I ask, what is a remote grid, like a microgrid or? Okay.
Yeah. So a remote grid might be a pocket of customers at the end of a circuit, for example, where we identify that with a solar generating station and batteries and stuff, a standalone power system, they could be powered and supported without having to be connected with the rest of the grid, such that we could just remove some existing overhead lines and serve them with a remote grid.
Okay. And overhead hardening, is that covered conductor or covered conductor and different other things?
Yeah, when we talk about overhead hardening, it at a minimum includes covered conductor, but we also evaluate and upgrade the associated connectors and poles and all that kind of stuff up to our existing standard. Certain existing assets may also already be up to the hardening standard, but we have a very clear standard for what a overhead hardened circuit segment looks like.
Okay, great. So Kristen, are you going to handle the hands raised?
Yes, exactly. Joe Mitchell has his hand up from Mussey Grade Road Alliance.
Yeah. Also, I see some people are asking to be unmuted, so we will do that. Might take us a minute.
I've unmuted everybody who should be speaking. If you haven't been invited to be a presenter, you're not going to be unmuted, but we will take questions through the chat and we will do a question and answer at the end.
Okay, Joseph Mitchell, Mussey Grade Road Alliance.
I'm sorry to interrupt again. We are recording this this time. We did manage to get that feature going, so just letting everybody know that.
Okay, Joseph Mitchell, Mussey Grade Road Alliance. Matt, couple of things I'd like to specify here. One is that when you're talking about combinations, you were talking about, say, overhead hardening in combination with the other standard modifications you would make. Are you also evaluating covered conductor in combination with other mitigations such as REFCL? And can you also discuss down conductor detection?
So these are all PG&E specific questions, right, that I think are appropriate when we submit our plan, and then various interveners ask us questions about the aspects of our plan. So down conductor detection and REFCL and EPSS are all operational mitigations, ways to operate your system or our system in a way that potentially reduces wildfire risk. That's an important aspect for any utility to explain. How do operational mitigations support or complement either overhead hardening or undergrounding, or do they not need to be used when you have undergrounding, for example? So as it relates to the guidelines for the utilities to submit their 10-year undergrounding plans, we think it's appropriate for energy safety to articulate that the utilities should explain what are your operational mitigations and how do they partner with various mitigation alternatives, including overhead hardening and undergrounding.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, I see perhaps
can-
we do have one person that I'd like to, Anita. I'm not sure who she is with. I'm gonna try to unmute her. Oh, did that work? So Anita, I did try to unmute you if you would like to ask a question or add.
Yes, I appreciate that, June. Thank you. My name is Anita Taff-Rice, and I represent DISH and Extenet Systems. They are both communications providers. And I am a little bit confused. I was on the meeting last week, and I reviewed the agenda for this week, and I see what you're going to talk about next week, and I don't see anything that addresses the set of comments from 3 different groups of communications providers about the effect of undergrounding on the availability of vertical infrastructure for communications equipment. And we do feel there's a very strong wildfire safety component in the loss of communications facilities. So could you help me understand when we will be discussing those topics that were raised by communication providers?
Yeah, I think one of the communication providers had a conflict on this date, so we didn't even contemplate that, but we do have working groups on the 21st, 28th, and December 5th if we need it. And so we'll do it in one of those. And I guess we'll try to do it in one where all of the communications stakeholders can be available.
Okay, well, can you help me understand? I apologize because I'm new to your office, and so I don't have a great understanding of all of the protocols. But there are a number of communication providers that have filed.
Pardon me, I'm sorry. We do have a lot to cover on this agenda. The communications is not on this agenda, but I'd be happy to call you after this meeting and talk through what the options are afterwards. Thank you very much.
I'm just trying to establish that we are going to have an agenda item so that communication providers have a fair and equal opportunity to raise their concerns. And I'm just not seeing it in the agenda so far.
Absolutely, Anita. So we really do need to get on. It's going to be a lengthy discussion. Everything is, in flux. We haven't set the next 3 agendas, and there's plenty of time to talk about communications, and we can discuss that after this call.
Okay, so how shall I contact you?
If you put your number in the chat, I would be happy to call you after the meeting. This is Kristen Ralph Douglas.
Okay, thank you.
So we have another question from Tom Long.
Thank you. I wouldn't say a question, a comment. The statute does specifically mention as an alternative covered conductor and REFCL. I think as a practical matter, that's going to be the key. The comparison between undergrounding and overhead hardening is going to be the key comparison that OEIS should be looking at in their comparison of alternatives. Covered conductor plus these other current limiting technologies such as REFCL. I don't think the statute means it needs to be only REFCL. And Joe Mitchell mentioned down conductor detection, and there are other technologies that are available to limit the discharge of current when a line breaks or when a line falls, hits the ground. That's going to be the main competing alternative. Covered conductor, with or without those alternatives, without those additional technologies, provides substantial risk reduction, and it's a very strong competitor to undergrounding. So it needs to be evaluated on a project by project basis.
Okay.
Arthur Fisher is next.
I wasn't actually. I think it was Sean.
Sean, you're next.
Sure, thanks. I just wanted to jump in for SDG&E. I agree with kind of the outline of the approach that Matt from PG&E laid out, and just add that SDG&E does have, to Tom's point, a few other we call them advanced protection type initiative, like our early fault detection, our falling conductor protection. And REFCL is something we're still evaluating, but isn't being implemented right now because of the way our system is configured. But we'll continue to work on that as part of the joint IOU covered conductor working group that's required per our most recent WMP approval. So we have some additional mitigation strategies that are available and that do pair with covered conductor, and not to step on the future questions too much, but we are required to report on the effectiveness of combining these things to energy safety, although that full study is not yet completed. It is something that we're working on. And one other thing I would like to point out is there are some operational things that have been in place potentially longer in certain service territories or in certain areas than others. And so it's important to know what's already being deployed to understand the effectiveness you'll achieve by deploying something additional. For example, if SDG&E already has falling conductor protection or sensitive relay profiles on a certain line, it will affect kind of the math or the calculation of adding in covered conductor versus going from nothing to covered conductor with other items. So that's going to be an important part of the utilities plan, is to specify what already exists on that circuit and what's truly incremental that's being added or compared to those circuits.
All right, and now I think Ian's the next commenter.
Thank you, Ian Fisher, Cal Advocates. This is actually good timing. Thanks, Sean, for kind of teeing that up a little bit, because what I really wanted to introduce was like what I'm hearing here, and I think we generally agree with, is there's like three major scenarios that have to be played through here. One is the undergrounding. A second one is a covered conductor scenario with perhaps some sort of operational assessment with REFCL, things like that. And then the third one, which I think, Sean, you just really teed up, is the business as usual scenario. What would happen if you didn't actually either do covered conductor or do undergrounding? What would an operationally based set of mitigations look like? So there's I'm seeing three potential big tranches there that could be useful in understanding and comparing the actual additionality that you would get from either undergrounding or from a covered conductor scenario. The other observation I would just like to make is that, just to take a step back for a second, the language of 83885 includes a statement about achieving comparable risk reduction between the different technologies. We need to understand what we mean by comparable risk reduction. Are we saying equivalent risk reduction? If so, how are you going to get that? And what does that actually mean? because risk reduction from covered conductor on its own may be somewhat less than the risk reduction for the same mile of undergrounding. So you're going to have to look at a different geography. So are we looking at different suites of projects? Or are we looking at an undergrounding project, then the alternatives to that undergrounding project? I think it's very important because we established this early. Otherwise, because we need to know what whether there is a hierarchy between different alternatives or an equivalency between different alternatives. Thanks.
So this is
Thank you.
Kristen. I'm going to jump in and ask you, one, how would you answer that question?
Okay. If, in that case, I take comparable risk reduction to mean that you're comparing equivalent alternatives. So if for every 100 units of risk reduction from undergrounding, you have to give me a project that gives me 100 units of risk reduction from covered conductor. That's how I would interpret it.
Okay, great. And I'll let everybody respond to that in a minute. I have a question, a follow-up question on business as usual. You mentioned no added, I'm assuming assets or technologies, but operational only. How do you define operational only?
Oh, operational only would be what is happening at the moment with things like fast trip, PSPS, those sort of operational kind of management techniques that they use. But also anything business as usual would be more also current vegetation management, enhanced vegetation management, things like that as well.
So you don't consider those to be mitigation strategies? Because I would have thought that they would be alternative mitigation strategies. If they're not currently.
Oh, if they're not currently being undertaken, then yes, they would be alternatives. But if they're currently being undertaken on that line, then that gives you how you would operate that line at this present time. It's everything other than the undergrounding, effectively.
Okay, thanks.
And Brian Landry.
Brian is next. Thanks.
Hey guys, so this is Brian Landry on behalf of Southern California Edison. We have a similar thoughts as Sean and Matt and Ian. I believe it's the language of the statute presumes that you're going to have an undergrounding project and you'll have a mitigation comparing to that risk reduction of that undergrounding project. We note that the statute also says cover conductor and REFCL. REFCL may not be feasible in all locations. So I just want to make sure people understand that and are aware of that. The other thing that I would point out, there may be other mitigation packages and mitigation suites that may be very location specific, and it'd be challenging to get a high level cost estimate or feasibility assessment in advance of the actual construction and design of that project. So we are supporting basically sticking with these two mitigations as good bases of comparisons, but welcome in any application the proposal for different suites or combinations thereof that may be very location specific. Thank you.
Anyone else have a comment they want to add to this? Go ahead, Ian.
Yeah, thanks. I would actually just like to get a reaction from, if possible, from the utilities considering whether it is hierarchical. You come in with your undergrounding project and then you do the comparison, or it's an equivalency, or given all things, we would recommend, but I'm trying to understand whether they think of these things being driven by the risk or driven by the undergrounding project. I'm not quite sure I'm explaining myself well enough here. But I'm just trying to work out how the utilities view this.
So
Go
this
ahead,
is this is Matt from PG&E. I mean, the fundamental building block of our system is our circuit segments, right? And so what we look at is the risk associated with each circuit segment from our wildfire risk model, which is a certain number of risk points to the way you're articulating it, associated with the existing overhead system. And so we can say like, hey, this circuit segment has 10 points on it. If we underground, we permanently mitigate so many points. If we do overhead hardening plus operational mitigations, it permanently mitigates certain number of risk, and in an ongoing basis can eliminate others, and then a status quo scenario. So our portfolio would still be articulated based on the circuit segments and what the selected mitigation is for each circuit segment. You could aggregate groups of circuit segments, groups of projects, to say this portfolio gets you 100 points and this alternate portfolio gets you 100 points, and they also have, you know, financial data associated with them. So I understand what you said. I think the data we have and we would anticipate sharing would allow for that kind of discussion. But presenting our plan in terms of like this scenario gets you 100 points, and here's another scenario that gets you 100 points in a different way, is not the way we, you know, actually plan our system, which is circuit segment by circuit segment. But I think you can create that same analysis by aggregating circuit segments in different ways to get certain number of points. So I don't know if I explained myself well, but that's how I think about it, is starting from the circuit segments, right? And then you can group those as you see fit.
Okay, thanks, Matt.
Can I ask a follow-up question? This is Kristen. So when you're talking about grouping things and aggregating the risk, what specific risks are you looking at? Are you looking at the reliability risk? Are you looking at the ignition risk, the consequence risk? Are you rolling it all up? How do we kind of unpack all of that so we understand what's being avoided here?
Hey, that's a really good, important question. I mean, I was mostly referring to the wildfire risk, which is the aggregate calculated wildfire risk of consequence times probability. We have all the pieces that make up this formula, right? And so we could focus on just that, on just ignition probability, for example, or just consequence. But what we're going to get to in the next section about how we prioritize references the fact that reliability, public safety, and cost efficiency are also important to this analysis of which locations are we going to underground and in what order. And so I think that's an important question, is at this level where we're talking about alternative mitigation strategies, are we also factoring in reliability, public safety, cost efficiency? We think that's likely prudent. But again, I think each utility should present how they are making these decisions, how they are stacking up different mitigations against one another, and which factors are important.
Great, thank you. And Sean, you're next.
Thanks. Yeah, no, I think Matt said it really well, so I'm not going to restate that, but I think SDG&E is in a very, very similar position where we analyze the different mitigations at the circuit segment level. And then I just wanted to comment really quickly on Ian's last point about the kind of the current day or do nothing scenario, however you kind of want to phrase it. I do like that thought. I also think that would be included kind of in your baseline risk and some of the things we talked about in the first workshop, right? All of the reliability, wildfire risk baselines and stuff would essentially be unchanged if we just continued to do what we're currently doing in those scenarios. So I think that might be captured already, but we're open to understanding how else it could be captured there.
Thanks. And Brian, you're next.
Yes, I think a similar response. It is a comparison of the underground project to the alternative. So you'd have to start with the underground project. But, you know, to Sean's point, to Matt's point, in order to prioritize that undergrounding project, you'd have to know what the risk is a priori to that project being developed. So it is 3 essential comparisons.
If I could ask a follow-up on that as well. I think Cal Advocates in their comments had talked about the fact that you're looking at the risk reduction, but are you looking at the risk reduction of the undergrounded line or the line that you're taking out of service from the overhead? So how are you making that comparison?
Yeah, so you know, only the overhead line would have a risk associated with it. The underground line would not. So with that in mind, it is default the overhead portion of the project that we're removing. That would be the baseline and the point of comparison.
So you'd compare the new undergrounded with the old overheaded,
That's correct.
or you'd be comparing the covered conductor on the overhead versus, okay, thank you.
That's right.
I don't see any other hands up at this point.
Great. So we talked about alternative mitigation strategies. I think we talked a little about estimates and methodologies. We didn't talk about that a lot. Do you think it would make sense to go on to the next slide and come back to the estimates and methodologies and things like that? I think so. So let's go to the next slide. And we can come back to that first one. So for the comparisons, what information do we need? And I've seen, some parties listed a lot of different information, but I want to go back through that now and talk about it to make sure we're not missing things, and also to discuss realistically, are these all things that can be included? Why don't I start? If no one, who wants to start? And if no one does, I'll pick on somebody. All right. How about Ian? And
Thanks, that's what I get for smiling.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, starting with 1. Okay, the way we generally view this is the first 2 comparisons. We think you're going to do all 3 comparisons firstly.
Yeah.
The first 2 comparisons to our mind go hand in hand. We don't see how you can really do one without the other, because depending on how you define baseline versus a scenario, that's one and the same thing. Getting back to what Sean said, we're comparing against what is being done or what is going to be done in the absence of the project, to whatever the project alternatives are. Then the last one, comparison or risk reduction provided the plan as a whole. Okay, so generally here we think you need to be comparing both at the project level and at the overall plan level. But the assumption is that the overall plan is additive and it's cumulative of the project. So you should be able to add up the projects and get to the total plan reduction. So we see the total reduction as being a check, I guess, on the accuracy and adequacy of the information in the individual project descriptions. That's, I guess, how we kind of see that. Henry might have something more to say on this, I think. I'm not sure.
So Henry's on mute. But I think he can unmute himself.
Hi. Yeah, I think what Ian said is fine for the moment. As Ian was saying, if you compare each project to the baseline, then you're effectively also, or each alternative to the baseline, then effectively you're also comparing the alternatives to each other.
Okay, does anyone have anything they want to add to that? No. Okay, so that's pretty self-explanatory, or somewhat self-explanatory. The second 2 questions, or the second question, I'm really interested in how we get time in there. And so the suggestion was, I think this came from Cal Advocates, for each year the plan provide analysis of risk reduction for mitigation activities. And I'd be curious to hear from the utilities how exactly that would play out in practice. Is that something they can provide?
Excuse me, Jean, I'm sorry.
You want to go first?
Tom Long from Turn. I was a little slow on the trigger finger on the chat.
Okay.
On the raising the hand. So sorry about that. I did want to comment on B1. A couple of things. Reading the statute, the comparison. They mentioned the word project a couple times in that subsection 4. So the middle bullet is what I think is the key comparison, a comparison of each alternative. And again, as I mentioned earlier, the really important comparison is going to be overhead hardening to undergrounding. And under the category of overhead hardening, there are going to be a variety of alternatives that should be considered. One is just covered conductor, and another is covered conductor with the alternative additional technologies such as REFCL, such as down conductor detection, such as early fault detection, the others that were all spoken of a moment ago. So those are the comparisons that we think are going to be the most important, because those are the ones that provide a nearly the same amount of effectiveness of risk reduction, mitigation effectiveness as undergrounding. And so that needs to be compared. But let's also recognize that the statute also it mentions twice the word cost. So it's not risk reduction by itself that needs to be compared, but it's risk reduction and cost that need to be compared. In fact, the last sentence of 4 says the comparison shall emphasize risk reduction and include an analysis of the cost of each activity for reducing wildfire risk. So cost is an integral part of this comparison. So when you combine risk reduction and cost, what you're talking about is cost effectiveness. That's the point. And so the key issue then becomes a comparison of the cost of effectiveness of undergrounding with the competing alternatives that I just mentioned on a project by project basis. That is the most important thing that the utility should be presenting and that the OEIS should be looking for in deciding whether it's appropriate in a given location. And we agree with SCE that it makes that locations vary considerably. Undergrounding may make sense and be very cost effective in some locations and may be very uncost effective, very difficult to accomplish in other locations. So we need to do that on a location by specific project by project basis. So I guess just to summarize, comparison at the project level of both risk reduction and cost, which combined is cost effectiveness.
Okay. And I brought us back to that slide with the statutory language. So it looks like next, James Ash.
Good morning. Talking off of Matt's microphone. So I'd just like to follow up on what Tom said. PG&E agrees that cost is a very important aspect of the comparisons. However, I'd like to reflect on the way that we compare those potential benefits and costs. One option is obviously a CBR, the total benefits divided by the costs, which is a great indicator of if a project is a good investment. But I also want to emphasize that we should consider the total benefits and total risk reduction permanently available per mitigation as well, so that we do not mask some of the potential benefits. So a direct cost benefit approach should also be considered.
Can you explain that one more time?
So the first option is a cost benefit ratio, total benefits divided by the costs.
Okay.
But another option, which should also be considered, is the total benefits minus the costs.
Okay.
I can give a very simple example of a CBR. You could spend $10 to save $30. That would be a CBR of 3. However, if you could spend $100 to save $250, that's only a CBR of 2.5. So while it's a lower CBR, it yields a much greater net benefit.
Okay. Okay, that makes sense. And so then,
sorry, can I
ahead.
just ask a clarifying? Are you suggesting that as part of a comparison of the different projects? Or just as part of the kind of information you would put in the plan?
Yeah, both should be used in consort. The total benefits could be masked by using a CBR exclusive approach. So we propose that we also use cost benefit for our comparisons.
Okay, thank you. It looks like Tom is next.
Thanks. Yeah. Turn strongly favors the benefit cost ratio approach. It's the evolution of that is important for folks to understand. It derives from the risk spend efficiency methodology that was arrived at through a very lengthy and detailed settlement that was adopted at the CPUC in the SMAP proceeding. So it has the support of all the key stakeholders, utilities, consumer advocates, et cetera. And the benefit cost ratio is the commission's new methodology that builds on that. That was adopted in a December 2022 decision. And so we fully support that. New variants that such as the one that was just offered don't have the buy-in and support of all the parties, and should not be used as the key measure that OEIS should be looking at when it's considering cost effectiveness. Should be using ones that are fully supported by all the parties.
Okay.
And Ian, you're next.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm just going to agree with Tom at this point. That was my concern. We need equivalent cost benefit methodologies between energy safety and the commission, basically. Otherwise, things are going to become unmanageable and incomparable. Also, I also have another concern that basically reducing everything to $1 cost, which you would need to do to really do a total benefit minus cost, kind of obscures, is less intuitive than understanding the risk versus the reliability versus the actual cost. Because you can net out lifetime cost before you add, because we're really looking across 3 or 4 dimensions here, which is something you get into later on when we start talking about wildfire risk, public safety, cost efficiency, and reliability. So I guess my real take home here is we need identical, identical methods at both agencies. Otherwise, it becomes just impractical.
I'm sorry. So why do you say that it would be impractical?
Because you're going to judge the actual cost benefit on one, we're using one methodology, say, and PUC will use their methodology based on the risk spend efficiencies and the history that Tom just laid out. That would be very concerning because now it's going to be very difficult to understand how they're going to relate to each other.
So Kristen, I don't know if you want to talk about this now, but I'm not sure. At some point, we're going to talk about how we use cost benefit ratio and other aspects of cost for energy safety. Do you want to talk about that now or wait till later?
I think we'll wait till when it comes up on the topic list so we can get into the full discussion of costs.
Okay. And then next on the list, I think, is James.
Just want to follow up and say that PG&E does agree with Tom. CBR is an appropriate way to represent the information as the benefit divided by the cost, but just also want to highlight that the net benefit root, benefits minus cost, is also a great way to highlight the total benefit of risk reduction from a project. So we impose that we should consider both as a potential benefit.
Okay.
And while PG&E is unmuted, Ian, merging the 4 considerations, risk, reliability, cost efficiency, public safety, will require getting them in common units, right? So the RSC model of just risk points from like wildfire risk divided by cost investment we're going to have to move to a cost benefit model where we do put everything into some kind of common units, which is a cost benefit, or, is a dollar, is a monetization of each aspect. And so maybe this is the detail for another conversation, as I think Krista mentioned, but yeah, doing 4 dimensions, we're going to have to get them into one unit.
Okay, and I know a lot of those are in the prioritization discussion that we're gonna have later. Before we go on, it looks like there might be somebody stuck in the lobby. Do you see that, Kristen?
I will look into that, and in the meantime, Brian Landry is up next.
Hey guys, so we note that this is an ongoing discussion about in the RDF proceeding, the risk-informed decision-making proceeding regarding the currency and the effectiveness of mitigations and appropriateness of various accounting procedures. We also note that OEIS has recommended that whatever is utilities planned for in the WMPs follow similar procedures, and in that we would also support having consistent procedures being followed for the SB 884 application. So the same methodologies used across all 3 applications, though there could be additional benefits that could be qualified within the application itself. We should have at least one particular accounting methodology that I think has been agreed upon in the RDF proceeding and is still being adjudicated presently. Thank you.
Can I ask a follow-up question on that? So, if we said to use the RDF process, which I think is the same as the CBR process, would you be
Yes.
able to have the information you need to do that, say, 3 months from now?
So the utilities are transitioning. The utilities already developed risk beneficiencies presently. We have been directed to transition to a monetized risk score, starting with PG&E's next ramp filing, which would be in May. So that would be the time frame that perhaps PG&E could plan for. Edison has not transitioned to a monetized risk score. We're not required to until our next ramp filing, which would be 2026.
So how would that play out? I mean, if we picked this as an important metric for the comparison, is this something all the utilities are able to do? Is there enough guidance from the PUC on what's required, and would they be able to do it in, the near term since?
I would start from Edison. I believe we can file with the information we have at hand. We have an open GRC proceeding, so we're constantly using this material. We also use the same material in our WMP filing. One point could be that it's the current stage of at the time of application, whatever status the RDF proceeding is in at that time. It could evolve over time, and we're already in phase 3 of that proceeding. We're likely going to have a phase 4 and maybe a phase 5. So we expect this to continue to evolve in the future.
Okay.
And Tom
And,
Long is next.
So yeah, I would be surprised if the utilities had difficulty transitioning to this BCR, given that it was announced almost a year ago, and let's see, PG&E's ramp is supposed to be filed in a few months, so PG&E should be ready to go with their transition to the BCR. They can tell us if I'm wrong about that. And just because Edison's is a couple years away doesn't mean that they shouldn't be able to be working on the transition now. And I don't think I heard anything to the contrary, but it seems like it should be something that's been in the works, and as was pointed out, the details are being ironed out in the PUC proceeding dealing with risk-informed decision making. Thanks.
okay. Guess I should go ahead to the.
We've
to the
actually got
slides.
James Ash.
Yeah, I was just going to confirm that we do intend at PG&E to present CBRs in May for the rant filing. However, we still encourage not to use that as the only criteria and the overall plan selection. Consider net benefits as well.
Okay, and that brings me back to my question about the laundry list of different pieces of information that stakeholders wanted to see in these comparisons. So we've talked about CBR, cost benefit. What other pieces of information do you need or do you want? For your comparison. So for example, location.
Go ahead, Tom, and then Katie.
Yeah. Oh, thanks. Yeah, again, we mentioned earlier project specific benefit cost information. So what we would need to see is the building blocks just to see the utility's final number for the benefit cost ratio. It would, of course, be needed, but we'd need to see also be able to get behind how they got to that number. So we'd need to see the inputs for the location specific inputs, what they identified as the risk drivers in that location, the effectiveness of the alternative mitigations in addressing those risk drivers, and how they identified the costs specific to that location. Undergrounding costs are going to vary significantly by location. It's probably going to be less true for overhead hardening, but probably there'll be some variation there as well. So we'll need to see the inputs, the building blocks that got them to the benefit cost numbers that they show on a location specific or project specific basis.
Okay, and I guess the other question was the time variable. So this would be, we'd see the same thing for each year.
Oh, well, time is thank you for raising that. I mean, that's also an important consideration in measuring and comparing benefits and costs, because overhead hardening tends to be able to be deployed a lot more quickly than undergrounding, and so you get the risk reduction quicker as a general rule with overhead hardening, and that has, because it produces risk reduction benefits sooner than with undergrounding. That means those benefits are going to be come out greater in a benefit cost ratio, because you're taking the net present value of these streams of benefits and costs over time. So risk reduction sooner is intuitively better. We want to reduce the risk in our highest risk locations as quickly as possible. And it also comes out that way in the benefit cost ratio as well.
Okay. Mr. Mitchell?
Yes, thanks. And this is more of a question back to OEIS and at some level, people from the commission who are here. Since we're taking the same inputs, it sounds like, from the plan and evaluating them on both the energy safety side and the commission side, I'm curious as how you envision the roles of OEIS and the commission will be differentiated. What basis for approval will OEIS be using versus what basis will the commission be using, so that these decisions are logically consistent and properly cover all domains? Thanks.
It's a great question.
And you have just jumped ahead to the topic for next week. So we will cover that with you next week.
Stay tuned.
Stay tuned, exactly.
Okay, and Sean?
Yeah, thank you. Just wanted to state that for SDG&E, at least, I think the comparisons are viable, and SDG&E can support that. And then again, as we do the comparisons at each location. I do believe they can be aggregated at the year level or at the entire program or application level that we have there, and that would be something we should present or should have available. Just another comment to note that we are endeavoring to, again, get risk reduction now, and we do have a suite of alternatives and other things that we're doing now to reduce risk. But it is important to note that the highest risk areas do tend to be favored by the higher effectiveness mitigations. And in the long term, we do want to make sure we're hitting the highest risk areas with the highest effective mitigations. That will give us the long-term risk reduction we're looking for on assets we expect to last for 40, 50 years or more.
Okay, so James Ash.
Yeah, Sean actually beat me to it. I just want to emphasize
Okay.
also the long-term investment and benefits that we reap over the 50 years of that asset, and not be focused on the short term, a mere matter of months separating completion of a project for overhead hardening versus undergrounding. Really focus on the long term. Thanks.
But is it really a mere matter of months, or is it a matter of 10 years? This is a 10-year plan.
I'm speaking to a specific given location that could perhaps be undergrounded in a few months, as opposed to maybe, a year or a few more months for undergrounding. So in that sense, it is a few months of separation for completion.
Again, it's a 10-year plan, so I guess we're assuming that there will be some description of circuits that you would like to mitigate at the beginning of the plan, but that won't actually get mitigated until the end of the plan. So how would you address that timeline issue when it in fact is not a comparison of what you're going to do in the short term, but a comparison of what you're going to do over the 10-year plan?
Understood. And I think that's where we have opportunity to utilize some of our operational mitigations in the meantime, until we can establish a permanent risk reduction method.
Similar to what San Diego mentioned.
Great, thanks. Next is Brian Landry.
Hello, everyone. So I just want to bring this back a little bit. I think one important thing to understand is you may have a different view of the locational risk score versus the overall aggregate risk score. Overall aggregate risk score may be a goal for the full application of the project itself, but the actual location score is more important, because that is the score that each individual project is going to be reducing the risk of. Meaning that you may not, it is unclear what the aggregate risk score would be used for, other than a sort of metric for the overall plan. But the more important score would be the project by project score. Given that, and this is important because every location the risk score of every location could change over time due to climate, changes in population, other factors over that 10-year plan. So it is really important to understand that location specific risk score as it evolves over time, more so than the aggregate risk score. Thank you.
Okay, great. So it's 11:08, and perhaps we should move on to prioritization. Yes.
We can do that. And Jean, Bashir can now run the slides.
Oh.
So if you'd like to switch.
Yeah, so I just stopped sharing.
So Bashir, if you could now share, that would be great. I did not give him a heads up we were going to do this exactly at this moment, so.
Well, the next slide is C2, and it's just the language from the statute, just what's required: identification of the undergrounding projects that will be constructed as part of the program, including a means of prioritizing undergrounding projects based on 1, wildfire risk reduction, 2, public safety, 3, cost efficiency, and 4, reliability benefits. And we wanted to talk about each of those and make sure we fully understand what everyone thinks those terms mean. The one that is the most interesting to me is cost efficiency. So I would like to hear from stakeholders on what is meant by cost efficiency in this context.
So this is Matt from PG&E. We can go first again. So as we were talking about in the last conversation, our vision for this, which I think aligns with what's articulated here and what's going on with the CPUC risk proceeding, is a combined cost-benefit analysis that monetizes each of the aspects of these 4 criteria. And so putting a monetary value on the wildfire risk that's being reduced, a monetary value on the reliability improvement, monetary value on the public safety improvement of any given alternative, like undergrounding or overhead hardening or some other solution. And then for cost efficiency, it includes, so it's a net present value of the cash flows associated with this project. So both the investment upfront to perform the project and the life cycle cost of maintaining and owning that asset. So how much is it going to cost to do the inspections, maintain it? How frequently do we forecast it to break down and need to be repaired, have an outage or some kind of failure? And comparing the cost associated with that mitigation, say undergrounding, with the similar cost analysis associated with an overhead hardening solution or a status quo, no asset upgrade solution, et cetera. So when we talk about cost efficiency here, we're talking about the net present value of the lifetime cash flows associated with the asset we would be proposing to install and comparing across alternatives.
Sorry, can you just repeat that last part again?
The net present value of the life cycle cash flows associated with the asset in question, if it's underground versus overhead, that allows us to compare the cost efficiency of different mitigations for the project in question, the circuit segment in question.
Great. So how are you specifically defining cost efficiency in that context?
The NPV of the life cycle cash flows. So the upfront capital investment in the asset, the ongoing maintenance over the expected life of the asset, including
right, but sorry, those are the inputs, but what is the sort of concept of cost efficiency here? Not the cost inputs that you're putting into the calculation, but the concept of what is considered efficient about the cost.
And I'll add, I just saw the term cost effectiveness being used interchangeably with cost efficiency in a lot of places. So that's part of why we're interested in understanding what stakeholders' understanding is.
So we view cost efficiency as the cost efficiency of the asset that we're installing, right? And so what is the cash flow? What is the cost associated with that asset? And when you combine that one narrow item with the NPV of the cash flows associated with the asset with the benefits you acquire in terms of wildfire risk reduction, public safety, and reliability, it gives you a fairly wholesome view on the return on your investment, right? And there's a couple of different ways to calculate that, as we discussed earlier. So that's what we view as the cost efficiency step in the language that's on the screen is the cash flows associated with your selected or modeled alternative.
Okay, Tom Long.
Yeah, our position is that cost efficiency and cost effectiveness are synonymous, and both mean risk reduction divided by cost. Risk reduction under the benefit cost ratio framework adopted in the 2022 PUC decision is a monetized value that's comparable to cost. So that's the accepted at the PUC measure of cost effectiveness or cost efficiency. So when you take that into account, wildfire risk reduction, the first term in this 4-term list is captured by the benefit cost ratio, as is cost efficiency. Public safety and reliability benefits are captured in the numerator of the benefit cost ratio. They are consequence attributes. They are safety benefits and reliability benefits are benefits that are gained by mitigating the probability of the risk event, here the ignition, by limiting or by mitigating the occurrence of that event. So all of these terms, the point is all of these terms are captured by the benefit cost ratio. They're all addressed. So it's a very convenient way of addressing all of the things that the legislature wanted to have addressed in a single value.
Okay, and in this case, we'd be using it for prioritization as opposed to comparing alternatives, which is what we were talking about earlier. So Ian Fisher.
Yeah, I just want to kind of say so. I just want to go in a slightly different direction with this, to be honest. It's okay combining everything into a single value to understand it, but you're layering on assumptions and you're laying, so those assumptions about what the costs are, what the benefits are, what the gains are. So those assumptions really, if you're going to do that, and which we should, then those assumptions need to be crystal clear from each utility and also vetted by stakeholders. I would all to enable us to do that, I would rather see the information presented in their raw units. So reliability and anticipated reliability gains, really that's going to be measured in SAIDI and SAFI and things like that for a given project. I would like to see that. For wildfire risk reduction, then we can do that as cumulative buy down, percentage buy down of total risk from your territory. Or you can do that in avoided wildfire risk days, or some sort of actual native unit to what we're actually dealing with here, so we can understand the relationship between the actual drivers, the actual inputs, and the ratios that we are developing. Okay, so I would like to see both the actual raw data, the raw analysis, and the ratios.
Okay, that's helpful. For reliability benefits, one of the questions we were going to ask today is, there is a standard for energy safety for evaluating the plan, and it only refers to PSPS and other similar de-energization outages. Here we have reliability benefits. Do people feel it should match the way the term is used in D2, the standard, or do people feel it should be defined differently here?
Matt, you've got your hand raised.
Yeah, and this actually relates to someone made a comment in there about, we're talking here about prioritization, and we were previously talking about mitigation alternatives and evaluating them. PG&E believes that it would be in most people's best interest for it to be for the evaluation methods to be consistent across the various aspects of this effort, right? And so the methodology we use to prioritize a cost-benefit analysis is also this similar information used to do the mitigation analysis on each circuit segment. So a cost-benefit analysis at the circuit segment level. And then similarly to your point, reliability benefits here, we believe should be relatively well aligned with the reliability benefits being incorporated into the substantial improvement criteria that the energy safety uses to approve the plans. So we think consistency is the best policy to keep things simple and also direct. We also think that that a wholesome view of all reliability benefits is in our customers' best interests and makes sense.
So what do you suggest we do about the limitation suggested by the legislation?
Well,
which does not define reliability as broadly as you are defining it.
We believe that the last stanza of that portion that references other outage programs is relatively inclusive.
And Tom, you have your hand up.
Thanks. In terms of prioritization, the looking at cost effectiveness is one approach that I just spoke to, but the main value that should be looked at is the risk score for the locations, and I'm sort of picking up on what Ian said, which I think is, he made a good point there. The risk score for the various locations, which is going to be very different depending upon the characteristics of the locations, tells us where work needs to be prioritized. And to speak to your question number 2 about the when should the means of prioritization be applied, if I can move to that. What the sensible approach is to be, for the utilities as much as possible, to be proceeding from the highest remaining residual risk, because some places are already going to be addressed with risk reduction mitigations. Proceed from the highest residual risk that remains and move on down. That's what we should be doing. Obviously, you want to address risk where it's highest first as much as possible. And that's especially important because it's clear that risk is concentrated in a relatively few miles. It's a curve, it's not a straight line, which means it's not constant based on the miles. It means it's you get diminishing risk reduction returns as you proceed down the list of risky miles. So we want to start with the highest risk miles and move on down. And so every year, the utilities, we would say for each year of their plan, they should be showing that they're targeting the highest percentage miles, the highest risk, the riskiest miles, in say the top, and I'm just going to throw out as a possibility, the top decile, the top 10% should be, that's where they should be starting. And then once they've addressed the miles, most or all of the miles in the top 10%, then they move to the next decile and down. And they should be doing that with a mix of undergrounding and overhead hardening. Undergrounding is not going to work everywhere. In fact, it's not going to work in a lot of places, and it's not going to be cost effective in a lot of places. So using a combination of strategies is going to be the best way for prioritizing risk and meeting the goals of the statute to get risk reduction prioritized.
Sean, you're next.
Yeah, thank you. Just wanted to say from SDG&E's perspective, our goal obviously is to address the highest risk areas first, as much as feasible. Now, our plan, I believe will show that the areas we're addressing and in other metrics we've already put out there for the wildfire mitigation plan and others, that we are addressing the highest risk areas in our service territory, and that should be the goal. But there will be things that come up during design reviews, field conditions that are unknown or unable to be known from a behind the desk kind of risk analysis, and it's not always going to be perfect. Now our plan again should prioritize from highest risk towards lowest risk, but again I do want to note that this is a long-term plan with the goal of reducing risk for the next 50 years. And therefore, there might be times where the highest risk areas may need to be addressed with other mitigations while we wait for undergrounding, because that will be the best long-term solution for that particular area. Things like our sensitive relay profiles, things like calling for a PSPS, doing that in the short term and undergrounding in the long term still may be the better choice rather than just addressing it with covered conductor right away and missing out on potential longer term benefits. So again, yeah, we would like to prioritize high to low. Field conditions may throw a wrench in that at times, but we will still need to look at the portfolio level. This is a long-term plan with assets that are, again, 40, 50 years of life, and we do want to take that into account.
And Matt, you're next.
Yeah, I agree with what Sean articulated there. I think that was well said, that there are areas that are going to be more difficult, but we should not shy away from undergrounding there for the permanent wildfire risk benefit associated with that. I do think that there are a couple ways you can break down how a undergrounding or system hardening program is executed. How do you select projects? How do you prioritize which projects to do first, second, third, or to start first, second, third? And then how do you execute your program? And the reality is execution in the field sometimes runs into snags or sometimes can't get the permit, and that may delay a project that was otherwise prioritized higher, but it shouldn't slow us down in moving down the prioritized list to the next project. So that said, how do you prioritize? Which projects do you move on first, second, third? I mean, the statute is relatively clear here that it shouldn't only use wildfire risk reduction. That's really important, and it may be the primary driver, but reliability benefits are also important, as we discussed a few minutes ago. And as Sean kind of laid out, the operational mitigations that reduce wildfire risk in the meantime until we can underground often have reliability consequences for our customers in terms of PSPS outages, EPSS or sensitive settings outages, et cetera. And so incorporating the reliability impacts of our hardening work, whether overhead or underground, we think is relevant and appropriate in the prioritization, and we think is consistent with how this statute is written. So prioritizing, that is selecting the order based only on wildfire risk, we're not sure aligns with the language here, and we think that incorporating reliability impacts is also prudent.
Ask you a follow-up question. How would you include the reliability impacts? What metrics would you use on that?
Yeah, it starts, as Ian mentioned earlier, with the customer outage minutes, right? How many customer outage minutes would be avoided by alternative mitigations like undergrounding versus overhead hardening? That can then be monetized, as has been established in our risk proceedings, to create a cost-benefit analysis, with the cost-benefit analysis including the monetization of reliability benefits with the wildfire risk, and then with cost.
Thanks. And Tom, you're next.
Thank you. A couple of points. First, the risk score, which is what we're proposing be the most important means of assessing the prioritization, includes the reliability risk, which, as the utilities are now calculating those risk scores, include the risk of de-energization events. So the risk score fully captures the concern of power being shut off preemptively or reactively, if it's done correctly. The second thing is I want to respond to this notion that I think you're hearing from the utilities, that covered conductor, the suggestion that covered conductor is not a long-lived asset. It also has a 50-year service life. Like undergrounding, it needs to be maintained. I mean, undergrounding, you don't just put the facilities in the ground and then it's not a maintenance-free asset. Once undergrounding starts, we'll be seeing even bigger budgets that utilities need for maintaining their underground assets, just as they do for overhead. And I mean, we're seeing big budgets for underground cost of maintaining underground facilities. So the effectiveness percentage values, the gap between covered conductor or overhead hardening and undergrounding continues to shrink over time. We're finding that covered conductor is more effective than was originally estimated. That's in the joint IOU covered conductor study that was presented in the 2023 WMPs. The most recent draft decision of OEIS on PG&E's WMP shows the gap narrowing even more, that effectiveness of covered conductor and overhead hardening is 70% or more in the field. And the effectiveness of undergrounding has been overstated, so that it's not necessarily the high 90s, but maybe closer to the lower 90s. And the overhead hardening effectiveness number I just spoke to doesn't include REFCL and other current limiting technologies that can be combined to increase the effectiveness of covered conductor close to the effectiveness of undergrounding. So it's not right to be trying to portray covered conductor as a short term. It's not short term or second class, because it's very close in effectiveness to undergrounding at significantly less cost. So I just want to respond to that notion that's being presented.
Thank you. And Brian Landry is next.
Yeah, I don't know if I would characterize SC's position as covered conductor is not effective or not a long-lived asset or any of those notions, and I don't want to really delve into effectiveness. I think that's more topic for the application itself. But what I would say is bringing it back to the RDF decision-making process in phase 2 of that decision. I think it's been mentioned before. There are specific rules, and I think we should go back to those as first principles. We certainly should provide a ranking of the mitigations and the risk buy down for all types of risks, wildfire risk, public safety, et cetera, as stated here. But we also note that mitigation selection itself is not only beholden to cost effectiveness. I think the commission is very clear about that. There's other factors that should be considered: funding, labor resources, technology, planning, construction, lead time, environmental permitting, amongst others. So it would be prudent, and I think the commission has been very clear about that, to have operational mitigations in place while those other items are being worked through permitting or construction. I don't think it's our position that we consider cover conductor temporary mitigation. We have deployed more cover conductor than most in the state to date, almost 5,000 miles. So I think that's a little premature. But I would say, as a first principle, we should go back to the RDF decision-making process. There's a row in there, row 26 in the Appendix A, that clearly demonstrates what sort of dynamic factors should be considered besides just cost effectiveness. Thank you.
Thanks.
I actually have some questions.
Sorry, go ahead.
Going back to Tom Long. So early on answering this question, I think you said that the CBR number should reflect all of these variables that we have for prioritization. And I was wondering how that matched up with emphasizing wildfire risk reduction.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Jean, for asking that question. And really, I should have said when I first talked about CBR capturing all those variables that the main really what captures those variables other than cost efficiency is the risk score. The risk score captures the baseline risk, the existing risk, and it captures the public safety risk. It captures the reliability risk. That's what I mentioned about the possibility of PSPS and other de-energization events occurring. So the risk score captures all of those. It doesn't capture cost efficiency, and cost efficiency should be a consideration. But in terms of your second question, and the third question, what should be the most important? The most important should be the risk score in determining how to prioritize. That only to us that only makes sense for the reasons I mentioned before,
yeah.
The risk curve and et cetera.
What risk score are you referring to?
So the utilities do a baseline risk score under the RSE/BCR methodology that the CPUC has adopted for risk-informed decision-making. And they can and should do that on a location-specific basis. They are, we've been litigating the PG&E GRC, and PG&E has a curve that shows how risk is distributed amongst the miles of its high fire threat district. And that curve shows, again, that diminishing returns as you proceed down the curve. So we should be targeting the highest risk miles and move on down.
So, and as a follow-up question, that makes sense, but now I'm wondering why we have these 4 specific items listed here. If there's a risk score that captures all of that in just the way we want.
Well, I think the legislature is using sort of layperson's way of thinking about it, but the good news is that we have developed through this proceeding at the PUC a way to capture these issues in a value that can facilitate the prioritization that we think that it's clear that the legislature wants.
Okay, thank you. I think Sean is next.
Yeah, I just wanted to touch on one other thing regarding the effectiveness of the mitigations, going back to kind of like point A2 here, where as Tom brought up, we do have some additional studies that we've done on the effectiveness of covered conductor, and we are currently working as required by our areas of continued improvement and our approval to look at the combination of mitigations right now. But I just wanted to note that those studies are not yet completed. They are preliminary, and some of the data we're using for those are what I want to call year-over-year effectiveness, meaning for SDG&E, for example, we have equipment failure as being mitigated 80% by covered conductor, which will be accurate in year 1. One thing we haven't looked at is kind of long-term. So you can imagine we have a transformer that we replace for while doing the covered conductor work. In year 1, we do think it's a significant risk reduction that we've mitigated by that transformer failing. But what we don't yet understand is what that does in year 10 or year 20 by having that overhead transformer there. It might fail further into its life. Whereas I think we have a little bit better understanding of the undergrounding side of that, meaning even if the transformer fails, an underground transformer fails, it is very, very, very unlikely to cause an ignition or risk event. So we are still working on some of these effectiveness studies and have come across certain things that we're still trying to figure out as part of the wildfire mitigation plan and our required areas of improvement.
Thanks. I don't see any other hands up, Jean.
Yeah. So I guess we can flip through this next slide
Sorry.
and see.
Tom Long.
Yeah. You're on mute.
Okay. Explosions do happen from underground facilities, and they need to be maintained. And so they're not the risk-free. They're not a risk-free methodology. Thanks.
I would agree with that, but in our history, SDG&E in our service territory, from the risk data we've looked at going back to 2015, we have not had any ignitions from underground equipment outside of vehicle contact. It's something we have looked into.
And you've looked into it since 2015, and prior to 2015, you haven't studied?
Not to my knowledge. I know for the WMP, for the wildfire mitigation plan, and some of the associated non-spatial data tables, we were required to go back to 2015 for historical information. I know we have that. Going further back, I would have to do more research.
Okay, Brian Landry, you're next, and then Matt.
Yeah, I would just note that it may be stretching a bit to say that we're reducing that much additional risk on the system for underground equipment failure. What we would note is that underground equipment failure is more correlated with asset age rather than the specific location. We note that there are aging assets that we are mitigating, and we filed in our ramp and GRC that are dealing with underground equipment failure, and these are on the older parts of our system and not in the anticipated rebuilt parts of our system. Thank you.
Okay.
So PG&E has a number of opinions about this, about what kind of assets, underground assets, have this risk profile and which don't, what the latest technology is. But we understand the purpose of this workshop to be to talk about the guidelines for evaluating going forward. So I think we're not going to engage in the back and forth on particular mitigation solutions, but we're happy to discuss the criteria for how we do evaluate them when we file our 10-year plan.
Okay. So let's move ahead to the next slide. So we talked about each of the 4 factors. Does anyone have anything they want to add to the 4 factors and what we discussed? And then we talked about, maybe we can recap here on how the factors should be weighted. We said wildfire risk reduction should be weighed the most, but that the risk reduction, the risk score from the PUC methodology would incorporate all of these. Is that correct? Okay. So next slide. Oh,
Can I just
Ian?
ask for a point, just a clarification here? And maybe this is just my lack of understanding, so please bear with me. My understanding is that you have there's the risk score as the RDF methodology, and we've talked about that and how you can stack the factors on top of each other. But my understanding is that the utilities use a different set of models for making their decisions on wildfire risk. You have your WDRMs, which are not the RDF models. Am I correct in understanding that, or is that my misunderstanding?
Ian, I can talk to that. Edison takes the outputs of our wildfire risk model and the natural units derived thereof and converts them to those unitless risk scores in terms of our MAVF. When we switch to monetization, we would simply monetize those values in a similar method.
Okay, so the input is the WDRM and the T and the transmission equivalents, and then okay, thanks.
That's right.
Same for PG&E.
Okay,
And
thanks for
SDG&E.
clearing that up. So my observation would be you want to look at the buy, where you may want to convert, but you also may want to look at the buy down in the original model as well. That would be my observation. That's to energy safety.
Okay. Let's go to the next slide. So in wrapping up, I think we have time to go back and discuss any of the items that we talked about earlier. Is there anything anyone wants to add? Maybe we could go back to the first substantive slide and just take a look at what we skipped. One more. And, oh, no, go forward a couple. One more, that one. Yeah. Let's go. I think we covered all of these except how energy safety should use the information to evaluate the plan. I think we're kind of understanding. I think we're getting a feel from what has been spoken about how stakeholders feel about that one. So let's go to the next one. Oh, we did these. Okay, go back one slide. So we didn't talk about the existing methodologies for calculating wildfire risk reduction for individual mitigation activities or undergrounding. That is kind of the conversation we were just having. And I agree it might not be very useful to have a debate about it right here. We're interested in learning about what are the resources we should be looking at to understand what the debate is? We've seen numbers cited in the PG&E GRC and other places. Matt.
Yeah, so without getting into the details of what the numbers are and how they may or may not be moving, there's a pretty decent record on this through the WMP process in terms of the effectiveness of each mitigation. There's been a direction by OEIS to jointly review that as a group, the three large IOUs, and to present those findings. And so that has been happening, particularly for overhead hardening. And similar methodology applied to undergrounding. So the answer to this question is yes. Are there existing methodologies? There are. They've been discussed in some length through the WMP process and in a joint IOU research project.
Okay. Anything anyone wants to add to that?
I actually have some questions about the CBR if we've got time, and if the other issues are covered already.
I think so.
So one of the things, so there's two main questions, and this is for everybody. One is that energy safety does not currently use the CBR. So we use a different methodology when we're looking at the wildfire mitigation plans. And so if we're using consistency within our own agency, how do you guys suggest that we do that with regard to the CBR? So that's the first question. And the second question is with regard to the decision that was issued last year, saying that PUC is going to move from the RSE from the MAV to the CBR. It seemed like there were a lot of elements of that kind of construct that still needed to be mapped out. And there were a lot of issues regarding specifically for reliability for PSPS that hadn't been resolved and that were going to be resolved at a later date. So things like SAIDI and SAFE that Ian Fisher mentioned earlier. In the specific decision, it mentions that those are not good calculations for PSPS. So I guess I'm wondering whether or not as a group you guys feel that the CBR is ready for submission of plans, and if not, at what point will it be ready, and what needs to be done in order to have all the factors for a CBR be ready for prime time. Brian, you've got your hand up first.
Yes. Beginning with PG&E's ramp in a few months, in May of next year, that they will actually have a benefit cost ratios developed for both wildfire and PSPS risk. It is our understanding that OEIS and their WMPs will eventually transition to that model. This is a WMP update year, so we recommended against that, simply to make sure we have an apples-to-apples comparison of risk buy-down over time. But we can foresee potentially in future WMPs that we will be eventually transitioning to monetized risk values or cost-benefit ratios.
So is that something that's actually been discussed at Energy Safety, or is that something that you are hoping happens?
I don't know about hoping, but I know we anticipate that it's going to happen sometime in the near future. And we have not discussed it with them yet.
So what is the anticipation based on then?
We hope that in the next WMP, which is a 3-year cycle, we can have a consistent basis for risk buy-down accounting across the 3 different utilities. So we're hoping that, if possible, to align it with one of those update cycles. That is
okay. So this is a proposal at this point, not a.
That's right.
Not any. Okay, thank you.
That's right.
And Tom? Sorry, you're on mute, Tom.
Sorry about that. I'm slow on the clicking here. You said, Kristen, you said energy safety does not use the CBR. I don't think anyone's using the CBR just yet, as it was set forth in that December 2022 decision. So you say energy safety uses something else. I'm not sure what energy safety uses, to be honest. I mean, I'm not sure I'm seeing a single thing, a single measure of cost effectiveness that energy safety is applying. And I just want to echo Ian's point from earlier, which is that this is a two-end or a two-sided process. That's not there's the first this SB8 these 88 SB 884 plans are going to be reviewed first by Energy Safety and then the CPUC. It really would be good for the two agencies to be using the same methodologies for measuring things like cost effectiveness. We're going to have disconnects if we don't do that. So I think the CPUC has set forth the blueprint for a benefit cost ratio approach that satisfies the needs of the statute. They're still working through details. That's all going to be worked through in the next, several months to year. And will that resolve everything? No, nothing will ever be fully resolved. These risk methodologies are always going to be capable of improvement, and regulators should be looking for ways to improve them. But that doesn't mean we wait for the perfect methodology. We have to act based on the methodologies that are available to us and that we're working through as we go along here. So we should use the methodologies. Hopefully, we would endorse the CPUC-based methodologies that OEIS would be applying in its review, and use the version of it that is at the time when the utilities are invited to file their applications. That's the version that should be used. And as the utilities, implement their plans, there's going to be changes in the methodology, and the information should be updated using the changed information. So this is not going to be fixed in time, but I really don't want to hope that we will not be standing around waiting for every issue to be resolved, because that will never happen.
I want every issue to be resolved completely before we make any decisions or go forward. Yeah. So we understand, obviously, that things are not going to be perfect. We're just concerned. We're not that familiar with the CBR, that there are still parts of it that need to be litigated, and that would make it difficult to use at this point. But if all the parties are, think it's fully baked and there's nothing left to litigate, just things to improve and evolve, then I'm, that's what we want to hear. Ian?
Yeah, just to build off of what Tom said, these are 10-year plans. We're looking to both submit, approve, and then work the 10-year plan. There is inevitably going to be some sort of change of projects through the process.
Yep, that's the topic for next week.
Yeah, I know, but I'm just setting the stage. The issue is, CBR is useful, but we've had 2 or 3 other risk methods before, between 2023 and 2016, 2013, whenever the risk process, the ramp process started. So I inevitably expect there's going to be another risk method coming down the road. We need to be able to future-proof these plans to future methods. And the way we would do that is actually by making sure you have all the information in its raw format. So you have the risk model, and you have the risk model output in its raw format. The same for the cost, the same for the cost, the same for the actual reliability. And then you can build back up from there to whatever CBR or whatever method of comparison you want to use. Because you're either going to have to benchmark it, you're going to have to choice. You either have to benchmark it and stay static in 2023 or 2024, or and then everything going forward is going to have to benchmark against that, or you're going to have to rebuild to be able to make comparisons to allow you to assess whether you can swap out projects or not. So to build in the dynamic nature, you may need to get an effective plan. You're going to need everything. I would advise getting everything in its relatively raw form. That's just my observation.
So, Kristen, noticing that we have about 7 minutes left, is this a good time to talk about next week?
Sure.
So we've been working on questions to send out in advance of the next workshop, and we should have those out today or tomorrow. The main topic is flexibility changes, model changes, how we might handle different things that come up. And I guess we're also going to talk about coordinating with CPUC and workforce development plan.
Yes.
Any questions about that?
So we will be sending out the questions, as Jean said, via e-file either later this afternoon or tomorrow morning. So as part of that, if there's any additional questions or things, topic areas that you would like us to include in that, please feel free to send those in by Thursday of this week. And also the slides for this week have been posted on our website. And I'll figure out how to post this recording as well. Or I won't figure out, I'll get someone to figure it out. Thank you. Ian, you have a question?
Yeah, I want to make a request actually. Given the cadence of these workshops, can there be an opportunity to provide comments on all the workshops at the end, given and have a reasonable time to do that? Simply given the cadence and the way these are panning out, it may not be feasible to comment on all, actually provide written comment on all the workshops.
So what kind of timeline were you thinking of?
Good question. What's your timeline for response
So
to this?
we are, going to be working on the guidelines. We're starting to work on them now. So we realized we want to get all the comments, I think, but are you thinking of one big set of comments after all the working groups, or maybe?
That's what the request is, yes.
Okay.
Just, I mean, just because of frankly, it's just because of bandwidth issues from our perspective. And so I would expect we'd be looking at what date is, I'm sorry, what date is the last workshop here? It's the 4th, isn't it?
The 5th of December, Tuesday, the 5th of December.
So we'd be looking at wanting to get you comments certainly before Christmas, but maybe 2 weeks after that.
Yeah, if I could pipe up, as Ian was saying, I know the agenda that went out a few days ago has an opportunity to submit comments next Monday. It's pretty difficult to turn around comments on each working group meeting in just a few days. So as Ian is saying, it would be, I think, simpler and more convenient to do a combined set of comments in December. And I think 10 to 14 days after the last working group meeting is pretty realistic. So that's what we would suggest.
Thank you for that suggestion. How do the rest of the parties, or sorry, stakeholders feel about that?
Mitchell, we're in favor.
This is Tom. I think turns in favor. Katie's, let me know if you disagree, but
I don't disagree. I think I would also sort of want to clarify if the purpose of comments is to clarify previous positions submitted, additional comments, or is it kind of supposed to be read as a written version of things that we've said in workshops, or this is an addition to what we said in workshops? I think some clarity on that would also be helpful, because it would definitely shape the form of the comments that we would draft.
Thank you. And Henry's first, and then Matt Pender.
Oh, my hand was still up, but I agree with what Katie said. Some guidance would be helpful about, whether you want comments on sort of new and unaddressed issues, or just an opportunity for people to sort of crystallize in writing things that they've already said, or both. So that would be helpful. Thank you.
Great, thanks. Matt Pender.
Yeah, I mean, I think actually related to that, PG&E would just like to understand the context of the process here, right? We all provided written comments before these workshops, right? We're having these workshops, I think, to verbally clarify and ask some good questions. What do we anticipate getting out of what do you anticipate getting out of comments at the end? Would they be and is there a risk that they would largely just be restatements of what folks have already said through their initial comments and through these workshops? And then how does that feed into a timeline for, maybe another round of a draft guidelines, et cetera? So I guess PG&E is open to it, but would like to make sure it adds value for all parties, and isn't just a restatement of what folks have already said previously.
Thank you. And Brian Landry?
I support the sentiment behind Matt's comment. I think, we're open to providing additional comments. It's largely going to be in alignment with our existing comments. We would much prefer waiting till we get a more firm proposal to develop comments. I think that may be more constructive to the record. Just a thought I want to put out there. Thank you.
Thanks for that. Okay, we will take this under advisement and get back with you all. So before we adjourn, is there anything else anyone has? And also want to say thank you again very much for all of your participation. Matt Pender.
So just in respect to the holiday coming up next week, it sounds like you're planning to move forward with the workshop next week. PG&E can't be the only party that's going to have coverage issues, but if it's moving forward, we'll work with that. The next workshop is 2 days after the holiday weekend, and so to the extent that questions associated with all of the upcoming workshops can be available in advance, Henry mentioned it also, that would be helpful to folks, particularly who are going on vacation and might be disconnected during the holiday. So that's our only request, is to be clear on the upcoming topics and questions for the next couple of weeks, since I think we just have 3 of these left.
Thank you. I think that's a good point. It just now, show of hands, who is going to have trouble in the next 2 meetings, the 21st and the 28th, in terms of attending? Okay, great. Well, thank you for that, and we will take that under advisement and figure out how we're going to work around that. Thanks for calling that out. Okay, great. Well, thank you all again very much. These are really good discussions. I really appreciate everybody's level of participation. Jean, do you have anything else?
No, this was really informative, and I'm glad we had this discussion. It was super useful.
Great. Thank you all, and see some of you next week, or we'll look at the schedule. I don't think there's anything we can do about the schedule. We are pretty much trying to move as quickly and expeditiously as we can. So I'll be reaching out to some of you to figure out how we can maybe get some coverage on this. Thanks again, everybody. Have a great day.